Ron Hicks was born in Adelaide, was baptised in Adelaide in August 1953 and now lives in Adelaide, but has been in many places in the meantime. Ron was a member of the Washington DC Christadelphian Church, or ecclesia, for over 50 years, and now, back in Adelaide, he attends the Happy Valley Ecclesia. Ron joins Wilderness Conversations to share some of his journey of faith. Ron, thanks very much for joining Wilderness Conversations.
Good, I'm very pleased to be here with you today.
You wrote a book called My Journey in Faith, and you made a really interesting statement. You made lots of interesting statements, but in the preface you made an interesting statement around your motivation for writing the book. Because you made the point, I'll quote, you had a long life aversion to talking very much about yourself. I resonate with this because people often say that to me when I ask them to join me on the podcast. But you had a reason why you ended up writing a book about your life. What was that reason?
Well, the reason is this, that I really enjoy reading biographies and autobiographies. I've always had a lifelong interest in that sort of literature, and I read a number of books on that genre, really, but. Then I thought, I wish more brothers and sisters would write these sorts of books. And then, as I mentioned in the preface of the book, I realized I was being a bit inconsistent. I was wanting other brothers and sisters, particularly to write their autobiographies, or then wasn't prepared to do it myself. So that was a sort of a key motivation. And on top of that, there's a sister in the Ottawa Ecclesia in Canada who's a professional editor and for the Tidings magazine, and she pressed me quite strongly to sort of move in that direction. So that's how it all happened.
Well, it's out of print now, but I managed to get my hands on a copy, and it's a fantastic read, and I really enjoyed it and found it quite engaging all the way through and quite encouraging as well. So for those who haven't got it, I'm not sure if you can get it. I assume it's out of print, but there's plenty of copies floating around. You'll probably find someone who's got a copy. Let's go back to the beginning for you and just tell us a little bit about where you were born, where you grew up, and some of the, the important early influences in your life.
Okay, well, I was born here in Adelaide, South Australia. I was very blessed, actually, because I was brought up in a very godly home. Both my parents actually did not come from particularly religious backgrounds, but they came to the truth just before their marriage, and they provided my brother and myself with a wonderful spiritual environment. It was very stable. It was very spiritually focused. And so as I dedicated my book, I dedicated to them. Their influence was exceptional. And so the home influence was very, very powerful and strong and sustaining. But at the same time, at the time, the Adelaide Ecclesia was very large when I was growing up. It was a big ecclesia of 500-600 members. It was really quite sizable, and it was a wonderful ecclesial environment. So I had a wonderful mixture, really. I had a very good family background, spiritual background there, and I had a very strong ecclesial background, which provided all sorts of spiritual encouragement for folk, including young folk. And I feel that I benefited from that, from both those influences to a major degree.
Where did your mum and dad come into contact with the gospel?
Well, my father before he was married, had a next door neighbour who, I must say, rather eccentric brother, whose name I won't mention, of course, who was very interested in international affairs, and my father was also very interested in that. But this brother, the next door neighbour, was made very good use of the opportunity to explain to my father how the scriptures sort of provide a good focus for understanding international developments and so on. So that was the vehicle through which my father became interested. And then my mother, that was, as I said, it was before they were married, but my mother was equally receptive, and so they were baptized just before their marriage. So my background is not really a traditional Christadelphian background. It's from a background which would say came from the outside community.
You said you had a sort of a vibrant ecclesial life. For a 12-year-old, 14-year-old, 16-year-old leading up to the age of your baptism, What were some of the sort of key activities and important influences for you?
Well, the two key things there, I would say, were the Sunday school and the youth activities. As far as the Sunday school was concerned, it was a very well run, very disciplined Sunday school. It had a lot of students. I can't remember now, a couple of hundred. It was just a very, very big Sunday school. But uniquely, I guess, for the time, it was very focused on written. We always seem to be sitting for written examinations on something or other. And so the discipline of preparing for Sunday school, for preparing for these exams that seem to go on forever, all that was a good influence. And concurrent with that, of course, was the youth activities, because with a big ecclesia, there was a wide range of youth activities, spiritual, of course, but also social, and that was a wonderful foundation for growing up. And also the mutual improvement classes. They even had a younger mutual improvement class for those who are under 21. So the whole environment was, I would say, disciplined. It was very Bible focused, and it was also at the same time very enjoyable. And obviously, I made friends there that have been lifelong friends since I've come back from living abroad for a long time. Catching up with old friends is just a real treasure, and a lot of those friendships were made in very younger years. So altogether, the upbringing was a huge blessing, and I thank the Lord continuously for that.
What were some of the activities you got involved with as a young brother after you were baptised?
Well, the mutual improvement class is one thing, of course, and of course, giving one or two of the first classes was sort of traumatic. And I remember so well. The very first time I had to give a talk to quite a large gathering in the ecclesial hall. That was called the Temple, still is actually in Adelaide. I never forget that the first occasion when I had to give my first talk to a big audience. I was a second on the speaking list for the evening, and I thought I'd fall through the floor. And eventually, my time as the second speaker, I was on the platform, and then halfway through the talk, my mind seemed to go complete blank, and there was a long pause. And so after the talk, I asked some of the folks there, including my family, "What do you think of the long pause?" And they didn't even recognize it. So I was so uptight on the occasion, I guess, that I was very sensitive to that. But they're preparing for classes, engaging all sorts of ecclesial activities, helping. And I was also following my father's footsteps. I was the secretary of the Sunday school at quite a young age. That was quite a responsibility, although I didn't do much else apart from move chairs around. That it was all that was integrated, and the main thing to say, I suppose, is the ecclesia was just the center of my life. It was the focus, and not onerous at all. It was extremely enjoyable and fulfilling, and remembered with a lot of affection.
That is a blessing. With your parents and your brother, you went on an overseas trip, which I imagine back then would have been on the rare side. I mean, obviously people travel internationally regularly now, but back in, what was it, the early 1950s?
Yeah, 1954. That was a major event, because my father very much wanted to go to the UK because of family links there. And my mother said, "Yes, we'll go." But the two boys, my brother and myself, come with us. So we obviously were on my mother's side. so we joined the trip, the 6-month trip. But it was quite a decision to make, because oddly enough, this might seem rather strange, I guess, but a key factor was that we had been attending Sunday school without any miss for 9.5 years, and to be away would break the 10-year record, which, well, not record exactly, but 10-year sort of milestone. And my parents that might seem a sort of an odd criteria, but they're wondering whether we should wait until this interesting milestone of 10 years without missing school on any Sunday had been achieved. But anyway, the fact of the matter is we did go on the trip in 1954, and it was a wonderful trip, really. of course, those days you sailed to the UK. It took a month to get there and a month to come back again. That was a wonderful experience through the Red Sea, through the Suez Canal. Anyway, the trip to the UK was a wonderful experience, and of course, again, the focus was pretty much on, or to a large extent, was visiting brethren and sisters in various parts of the UK and also in Germany. And we spent about four months, I think, in the UK and Germany, and then came back later in the year. So all that was a great experience. And also I enjoyed on that trip both to and fro, having a couple of 2 or 3 days in India. And that was a fascination for me because in India and the Indian subcontinent later in life became quite a focus of my work activities.
Indeed. I guess even travel. I mean, people talk about a travel bug. Maybe you got the travel bug in 1954.
Well, you mentioned an interesting point about the somewhat infrequency of international travel at that time. I remember very well the year before we went, which is 1953, Brother Lindsay Cahoon and Brother Press Mansfield, who are very well-known members of the Adelaide ecclesia, they were given a farewell sort of evening, really, in the Adelaide ecclesia. And it was very strongly supported. The hall was full. It was such a rare event. And both at the end of the program, Brother Peirce and Brother Lindsay Cahoon had to give a talk to the audience, and they were completely wound up, completely exercised about this impending trip. And dramatically, Brother Lindsay Cahoon was given to dramatic gestures. He unfurled all his stapled sea and air tickets and all the rest of it, stretched from one side of the hall to the other, and it was unfurled with great panache. And the audience was sort of agog at this extraordinary trip with all these flights and sea voyages and who knows what. But it was just, I just mentioned all that because it really was quite not a rarity, but it was somewhat unusual to take a long trip away from Australia.
I didn't work out what year you were born in. How old were you when you went on this trip in 1954?
18 years of age.
Right.
My brother was just over a year older than myself, so it was just a wonderful trip at a very formative time in my life.
What are some of your memories? Because you would have go to lots of different ecclesias and met lots of different brothers and sisters. Was there an overwhelming sort of insight or realisation from that trip with regard to how brethren and sisters lived in other places?
Oh, very, very much so. Very much so, because just seeing ecclesial life was very interesting. The number of ecclesias there, as you went from town to town, there were so many ecclesias in Britain. I found that quite impressive. There was somewhat of a sadness to it, of course, because at that time, the reunion of the two communities in the UK had not been completed. It was completed just very shortly after we were there, but it meant that unfortunately at the time we couldn't. We were, in terms of fellowship, we were restricted to the sub-district fellowship. When at that time we did not really have access to the central fellowship. Sometimes it's best not to talk about these things, but on the other side, there's a big plus factor because when reunion of the two fellowships was accomplished in the mid-1950s in the UK, it was such a huge development. This disappointment we had in sort of not having completely free access to quite a large part of the brotherhood in the UK, all that was that division was dissipated really with the realization of reunion in the mid-1950s. So, and we also stayed, just one other point, we stayed with Brother and Sister Cyril Cooper in London for many, many weeks there. And that was extremely hospitable. And they were quite well known, and so it gave us wonderful access to ecclesias throughout Britain. To put it in the most general terms, it was another exhilarating spiritual experience, which was exhausting. We seemed to travel everywhere. We even drove down to Rome and back. I don't know how we managed it. It was quite an exhausting program in a way, but certainly memorable.
I'm interested in your statements about fellowship because it's when you've got it, it's not something you appreciate because you've always had it. And in Australia, largely speaking, we've had the benefit of the work that was done in the 1950s. And for someone like myself, just a little bit younger, have really never had the experience of not having that. So I think that's really interesting to hear you make that statement, and it obviously had an effect on you.
Well, it had a big effect, particularly as some of the well-known speakers like Brother John Carter and others, some of the really well-known speakers at the time, we did not really have full access to. And that was disappointing, Brother Norris. And you can think of a lot of Brother Whitaker and many others who are very, very capable speakers and exceptional Bible scholars in many ways. It meant that we didn't have full access to them. Of course, we went to a few of the Bible classes and lectures and so on, but it was just there was an awkwardness about it, which was there at the time. But that's why throughout life I've always had a strong feeling that we should press for unity as much as possible, as long as, of course, it's on good scriptural foundations. But the disadvantages of disfellowship, I think, are quite acute. And every effort, I think, should be made to try and have a unified brotherhood from which we all obviously benefit.
Around this time, you were deciding on what career choice to make. What were some of your early thoughts, and where did you end up?
Well, when I finished schooling, I didn't have much of an idea what I was going to do. I didn't have any particular sort of preference or idea what I would do. So my father was actually in the insurance business, so he arranged an employment for me in the AMP, which is a life insurance company in Australia, and my father's main concern was that I take a position which would not involve in any social engagements which would sort of be discouraging spiritually. So my first position for 4 or 5 years was actually with the AMP Society, but which was a very interesting organisation, but there was no career opportunities there at all. You just clearly would be a sort of static career, nothing would happen. So I got weary of that. So eventually I remembered that I had a Commonwealth scholarship, which I should have taken advantage of. So I went to university took a degree in economics, and then.
Why economics?
Well, it was my default, actually. Medicine wasn't quite my thing. Engineering was not my thing. It was almost ruling out the others.
Yeah, right.
And it turned out to be a God-given choice, really, because it opened up vistas of employment, which later became very, very helpful for me, particularly in terms of missionary activities and so on. So anyway, I left when I finished university after 4 years there at the Adelaide University in economics. I had to leave Adelaide because the degree in macroeconomics, there was no career in Adelaide at all. So you either had to go to Sydney, Melbourne, or Canberra. And so I took a position. I was offered a position in the Reserve Bank of Australia, which were just then being established as the Central Bank of Australia. Excuse me, that was a God-directed decision, certainly.
So you were one of the, well, not the first employees, but you moved to the Reserve Bank of Australia right in its inception, and I've just assumed it's always existed, but that's, of course, not the case.
Well, no, I should clarify that the central banking functions were previously under the umbrella of the Commonwealth Bank. The Commonwealth Bank, which was
then owned by the federal government.
Yes, that's right. The Commonwealth Bank had two functions: the trading function and the central banking function. In the early 60s, the central banking functions were taken out of the Commonwealth Bank of Australia and became the Reserve Bank of Australia, which of course it is now. So I joined the Reserve Bank just after they had opted out from the Commonwealth Bank and became a separate entity. But the employment at the Reserve Bank was particularly a God-directed because it gave me it led into other avenues of my employment, which were very beneficial to me spiritually and in terms of mission opportunities. So the time at the Reserve Bank was particularly helpful and enjoyable too.
You were a young brother and you're moving state. You had to move from Adelaide to Sydney. So life in Sydney would have been a whole new experience for you.
Well, it was actually, and I enjoyed it. When I went to Sydney, Sydney's always an exciting city. But I decided when I went to Sydney ecclesially, I would join a small ecclesia, because in Adelaide I'd always been a member of a very big ecclesia, as I mentioned. And so I joined an ecclesia which was called the Burwood Ecclesia. It was called Little Burwood, actually, because it was very close to another much larger ecclesia, the Shaftesbury Road Ecclesia. And I joined this Burwood Ecclesia, which were mainly comprised brothers and sisters who'd come out of the Concord Fellowship, which had previously been the Old Paths Fellowship, but now had just joined the Central Fellowship. So it was very nice joining a small meeting of enthusiastic brothers and sisters who just appreciated the benefits of coming over to the bigger Central Fellowship in Australia. So the time at the Burwood Ecclesia was very, very nice. And of course, living in Sydney and working in the Reserve Bank, I found the whole experience very, very interesting and uplifting. I was only in the Reserve Bank for 2 or 3 years, and they asked me whether I'd be interested in doing an exchange with the Reserve Bank of India, doing a study of the short-term money market in Bombay and in other parts of India. So that was a wonderful opportunity, really. So I seized that opportunity of spending quite a few months in India, working at the Reserve Bank of India in Bombay, and that again was triggered by the employment at the Reserve Bank of Australia, because they arranged it all and encouraged it, and it sort of was the seed of my later interest in missionary activities. That 3 or 4 months I had in India was very important in terms of enthusing me for mission activities.
So on return to Sydney, I note that the Reserve Bank at that time moved to a building in Martin Place.
Yes.
And in your book, I chuckled when I read you watched the construction of the Sydney Opera House as the iconic structure gradually took shape. What an extraordinary memory.
Well, it was. The Reserve Bank was a lovely new building. It had just been built, of course. It was a new institution. It was a lovely building on the corner of Macquarie Street and Martin Place. And I had a lovely office there, really, just on the 15th floor, I think it was, looking out across the Sydney Harbour. It was just gorgeous. You'd have to be distracted from your work to look out and look at the beauty of the harbour. But there, way in the distance, you could see the Sydney Opera House gradually being built. Sydney's always been a special place for me. I enjoyed it ecclesially. I know it's frustrating traffic-wise. I know all the problems with Sydney, but the time I had there, the 10 years I had living in Sydney, I very much enjoyed it. But then career-wise, the Reserve Bank was very generous in providing scholarships or financial arrangements where you could take a year off to further your studies, to do graduate studies in economics. The typical thing for the Reserve Bank was to send you down to Canberra, to the Australian National University in Canberra, to do some studies there. But I didn't want to do that too much, because it was all it was just sitting in a corner writing a thesis on some subject or other. I really wanted to have more training in theoretical economics, where you're in classes, where you're taught. And so the only prospect of that, well, there's no prospect of that in Australia at all. So the bank surprisingly said to me, why don't we send you abroad and do that sort of study abroad? So I thought that was an extraordinary offer, which I took up, and that led to the time I had at Yale University in the US, which was fully looked after and financed by the Reserve Bank. So the Reserve Bank was a wonderful help to me in moving forward.
It's great to see the investment in young people in their development like that's quite inspirational. I think in between sort of that time, correct me if I'm wrong, but you took some time off and went to, Britain and the Holy Land just as a young man. Is that right? So that was in your early days at the Reserve Bank?
Yeah, that's right. I should have mentioned that. That was jumping. That was before I went to the United States.
Yeah.
Right. The Reserve Bank had another scheme. It's just a wonderful institution. It still is. I respect the Reserve Bank a lot, but they had another arrangement that if you wanted to take 6 to 9 months to travel abroad, they would encourage that, and they would arrange for you to work in the Reserve Bank's office in London, their branch in London. So I learned of that, and I thought, well, that'd be wonderful, really. And this preceded the university training. So I jumped at that opportunity and went across to the UK and worked in the Reserve Bank office in London. And of course, that gave me just a wonderful opportunity to get to know the many brothers and sisters and ecclesias in the UK. And at that time, of course, a reunion had been accomplished, and I had the full benefit of the wider fellowship. And that 6 months was absolutely wonderful. The work was not onerous at all in the London office of the Reserve Bank, and of course, I went to all the study weekends and heard all the well-known speakers and Oxford Conference, all the rest of them. I made full use of the opportunity to visit the ecclesias in the UK, and the brothers and sisters were so welcoming. So I made many friends with the folks there, and for a younger brother, that was again a great spiritual experience.
And you took the opportunity to go to the Holy Land. This got my interest in particular because I've been there a few times myself and have quite an interest in it. Of course, we'll get onto it, but you ended up going there many times. But this is 1965, so pre-Six-Day War.
Yes.
And when I've been to particularly Jerusalem, probably more so than other places,
yes,
I always kind of wish I had been able to go there before it became such a big sprawling city. It must have been amazing back in 1965.
Well, it was really, because that was yes, it was. That was before the war, of course, and it meant when you went to Israel, you didn't have access to East Jerusalem. All you could do is to sort of a viewpoint. You could look across to the Mount of Olives, but you didn't have access to the old city of Jerusalem, or going up the Mount of Olives, or walking through Garden of Gethsemane, and so on. So it was a much smaller country, of course, then. Yeah, that was on the way back from London. I spent about a couple of weeks, I think it was, in Israel at that time, and I travelled, from Eilat right up to Galilee. Made full use of it, but it was very different in later years when I went back to Israel for work. Later years, when the country, of course, was much larger, and you had access to the Mount of Olives, to the area across to the Jordan and so on. That visit I very much enjoyed. And from Israel, I went down into Africa. I went down to Nairobi, and then stopped for about quite a few days in Mauritius, where there was a new mission program just developing, and that was it was a great trip back, actually, from the UK through Israel, down through Africa into Mauritius and back to Australia. So I made full use of the travelling opportunity.
Well, you certainly did. You were certainly you had a level of curiosity and interest in travel, no doubt, as a young brother.
Well, I also, on that trip, I always made a point of being in touch with the brothers and sisters in Entebbe. When in Uganda, I stayed with brother and sister Johnson, who were there as missionaries. In Nairobi, I stayed with them. The Sykes, Steve Sykes and his wife were there, and Wendy Sykes were there. Well, Stanley Owen was in Nairobi, and then in Mauritius, there were some brothers and sisters engaged in mission activity there. So there are all these places. There was an ecclesial focus and an ecclesial interest, and a reason for being there, really. And on top of that, of course, the sugar on the cake there was the stopover in Israel on the way, and that was a very good way to start the trip back home.
you made a comment in your book, which I could actually relate to, and there's when you get to Israel, you feel like you're at home. I absolutely relate to that.
Well, I relate to it too, very much so, because the main thing is that what you read, the places you read about in Scripture come alive. You know, you can when you read Scripture again, having visited these places, you can picture the scene, and it's somewhat different to what one I'd expected. I hadn't expected Jerusalem to be so small. It's quite, you can walk around Jerusalem, in half a day almost or less. So it allows you to get a feel for the dimensions of the place, or the topography of the land, or how places fit. You know, when you read them, doing your daily readings, you can sort of visualize the scenes, really, even like the Galilee and the Sermon on the Mount. You know, when you've been to the place where the sermon was given, it's look across the Galilee and across the Sea of Galilee there. It still allows you to read Scripture with another dimension, with a perspective of having been there. You have some idea of the location, the topography, and so
on. Great experience. You were a young brother at this stage. You're not married, and you didn't get married.
Yeah.
And you mentioned that you had some interest, but they weren't reciprocated, which I did find amusing. Maybe I shouldn't have. What advice do you have for young people? Because not everyone gets married. No. So you had to sort of come to grips with that. Yeah. What are your reflections on that?
Well, it's a very good question, really, because this is a sort of more personal aspect, I suppose. But the overriding feeling I have on all that is the Lord directs your life, really. That I hope was a theme that came through from the book that I wrote, the autobiography. I felt that the Lord directed me, because marriage obviously would have been very nice, but then on the other side of the coin, I would not have been able to do many things I did. I have done. You know, if I had been married, it would have been impossible to have moved around as much as I have. I've visited so many ecclesias, have been involved in missionary activities. Would not have been difficult. It would not have been possible. It would have been very circumscribed, really. It's not that I didn't want to get married. It was just the way the course of life took, really. It was not. I wouldn't say it was even a decision. It was just the way events unfolded, and I accepted them as the Lord's direction, and unfolded in a way which I felt in the end was my own spiritual advantage. Because in marriage, I couldn't have done those things. It would have just not been possible. Now, I'm not saying one thing is better than another. It's just the way the flow of life was, and I took it strongly as the Lord's guidance, and accepted it, and joyfully so, because I'm very, very happy and content life.
Well, I think the theme of submitting to and allowing the Lord to work in your life very much did come out in the book. I think it was strong for sure.
So that was my objective. I really wanted that flavour, and it's not a contrived, hopefully not a contrived theme, but I just felt that that was a central theme I wanted to convey, that the Lord does direct one's life if one proceeds in prayer and with a good spiritual background, which I was given. Then the Lord's direction is absolutely critical, and I accepted that.
Well, you've taken the opportunity to go and do some study at Yale. So you left Sydney, left Adelaide, and went to the US. Another new experience.
Well, that was a big change, because that was again provided by the Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank was just an extraordinary employer in that sense, and again, seems odd to say it for central bank to be God directed. It seems very odd to say that, but it was, because he opened up all these different opportunities. So I took this graduate degree at Yale University, which is a very it was challenging, because it's a very good university, and the style of teaching there is different to what I was used to at the University of Adelaide. It was very, 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 how would you say that? the teaching was not just a professor standing up front just talking for an hour. It was all interactive, and I was just not used to that style of instruction at all. So, and you just had to contribute, and so it was challenging. But and of course, some of the professors there were very well known. So some very good economists there. So the experience was a challenge professionally, but very rewarding, I would say. But the very nice thing about it is that the Yale University it's only about 30 miles away, I guess, from the Meriden Ecclesia, in Connecticut, in central Connecticut. And so I joined, when I was there, I joined the Meriden Ecclesia, which was a charming ecclesia, just lovely. And I have the fondest memories of the times I was there. They looked after me. Of course, I was living in the Hall of Graduate Studies at university, so it was so nice to get away from the university, and the pressure of the university would always be a Sunday to look forward to, and the fellowship and hospitality that they provided was very, very memorable.
You have to tell the story of when you arrived there first.
Oh, well, yes. Well, the very first Sunday I was there. As I said, the university was about 30 miles away from the Meriden Ecclesia, and I booked a taxi to take me the next morning to the ecclesial hall, and they said that there's a shortage of regular taxis, and they'd be providing a stretch limousine. So I was alarmed, Oh my! I thought it was very amusing at first. Then, as I got closer and closer to the ecclesial hall, I thought, oh dear, what are the local brothers and sisters going to think of this? This young Australian brother arrived in this stretch limousine, and I arrived at the time of maximum embarrassment, actually, because it was a period between the finishing of the Sunday school and the memorial service, where quite a lot of the folks were outside and on the lawns. And so here I was arriving in this enormous black car. Oh dear! I was never allowed to forget that moment.
A great introduction to your new ecclesial home for the next little while.
Yes, it was, and amusing. But that was an ecclesia of about 50 members or so, and very nice, a very nice ecclesia, and extremely hospitable. And then during the summer months, I was given employment opportunity in Washington, but then of course took the chance to visit some of the American Bible schools. So, and at that time, Wilbraham was the main Bible school which I went to, and that was the year I was there was memorable. Brother Harry Whittaker was a speaker, I think, and Brother Alfred Norris. It was just it was a panel of biblical experts. So that was a time to remember.
You returned to Sydney via the Soviet Union.
Yeah, well, I'm always wanting to sort of maximise opportunities, and the Reserve Bank typically was saying, just come back anywhere you like. So which they'd done on the way back from London, I mentioned through Israel and Africa. So I thought, well, why not try something a bit ambitious? I always asked them, if this is reasonable. And they always said, yes, it's fine. So I flew from the US back to, I went to the UK, then went on to the Soviet Union when it still was the Soviet Union. I stopped in Leningrad and Moscow. In the middle of winter, it was freezing, and even more so in Helsinki in Finland, where the weather was, I don't know how many degrees below freezing. But that was interesting. I found Leningrad, or St. Petersburg, much more interesting than Moscow, because it has all the Russian history, the Hermitage, the old Tsarist palaces, and so on, and even and the whole Leningrad or St. Petersburg is an extremely attractive city, in particularly from a historical perspective. So that was interesting. Then I flew on from Russia down to India, and then stopped off in Sri Lanka or Ceylon, and then back home.
And back to Sydney for a period of time. In your overall life, a short time.
Yeah, that was interesting because I went back to Sydney and rejoined the Baptist ecclesia, and I was happy to be back there. And then the opportunity came up to be seconded to the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, in Washington, and I was offered a 3-year secondment. Of course, it was a bit awkward actually because I had to be very careful that I didn't upset the Reserve Bank. The Reserve Bank had been so good to me with these training activities and all the rest of it. I just couldn't announce that I was going to take this secondment. So I made quite sure the Reserve Bank was happy. And at the time, the governor of the Reserve Bank was very liberal in the sense that he felt that if you work for an international organisation, that's good for Australia and so on. So I went to the IMF with the Reserve Bank's blessing. Really, they didn't require me to resign. They gave me three years leave of absence to work in the IMF in Washington. So that gave me time to work out how I felt about working and living in the United States.
So whereabouts was that? Where did you go for that?
Well, the IMF was based in Washington, and the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, is an international sort of financial agency where most countries of the world are members. But initially I worked in the research department of the IMF, but then after you've been there for a while, you work on a particular country, and you sort of wait with bated breath to work out what this country will be, because you don't know, it could be anywhere really, anywhere in the world. And I was placed in the European department of the IMF, and then the nitty gritty, what country are you going to work on? And then I was absolutely astonished, and this is another case of God direction. I was astonished by being asked whether I would like to work on Israel, because Israel was at that time the Middle East Department would not accept Israel as a member, so Israel was actually administered by the European Department of the IMF. The economic relations were administered in the European Department. So I was my first assignment, country assignment for the IMF. My first country assignment was Israel, and that was wonderful, of course, because I went there many times to work. At the time, Israel was having quite a major economic problem, so they were borrowing quite substantially from different organisations, including the IMF. So these were negotiating missions for the loans they took from the IMF. But of course, it gave me a new dimension or a new opportunity to learn more about Israel, because people there the authorities there quickly got the message I was interested in biblical history. So they were very good to me, the way they took me to different places, during breaks, what have you, walking tours of Jerusalem and so on and so on. So that was one of the clearest indications of God's direction. Working on Israel was just, I didn't ask for it, it just happened.
Amazing. You would have had the privilege of being able to see the difference in Israel, or particularly Jerusalem, I guess, between 1965 and then later in the late 60s, early 70s, after the Six-Day War. That would have been amazing to go back and have that different experience.
Well, it was. And without name dropping, when I went on these missions to the IMF, with the IMF to Israel, you met the first week or so of the visits, or 10 days, were technical, where you're discussing the economic programs and so on. The second round was with the senior people, the ministers, where you're where the team was negotiating the final terms of the loans, and that meant that gave me an opportunity to meet and to these people who are well known, like Simon Peres and Moshe Dayan. They were there. They were ministers at the time. and Abba Iban, who was the foreign minister. That was a dimension which would have been normally out of reach. And it was very interesting hearing them speak and even conversing, of course, with some of them, quite a few of the meetings. So that was a background which I valued very much. And then, incidentally, on that, so when I was at Yale University, this is a side issue. When I was at Yale University, Golda Meir's son was in the music department studying cello, and so I always went to her talks. It was very interesting listening to these leaders, and you realise when you listen to them, you realise that these are just ordinary people in a way, or they're gifted in many respects, obviously, but they're ordinary people who are thrust into important positions. But that was a very nice aspect of the work involvement. You could meet some people which you normally wouldn't have the opportunity to do. And the other point that you've very mentioned is that going back subsequently, you see the changes. That's very interesting.
Can you? You could spend a lot of time on this, but just for us lay people, briefly explain what the IMF does, and I guess why you were going to Israel, what you were doing. And then I'm also interested in then connecting that with, your view on the extraordinary development of Israel as a nation, even financially, across those decades.
Well, it's an interesting question. I don't want to bore your listeners with details, but the IMF is... it was mainly economic advice. It offers advice to all these member countries. Every year or more, they assess the economic situation of these countries and recommend actions. Of course, these are sovereign governments who can do what they like, but the input from the IMF is usually taken into account quite a bit. So there's the advisory side, but the side which I was involved in more was the loan negotiations, because particularly at the time when I was going there for work, Israel was in a terrible economic situation. There was hyperinflation. The inflation rate was over 1,000%, and so they were needing to borrow quite heavily. And so with loans of this sort, you have to negotiate the terms. What the exchange rate policy will be, what the monetary policy will be, or what. And it's up to them in the end to decide whether they accept the advice or not. But it's a negotiation which goes back and forth to determine whether the loan could go forward or not. And at the time, as I say, the Israeli economy was in very bad shape. In fact, hyperinflation was so bad that the normal joke was that if you went from A to B, you took the bus rather than taxi, because the bus you pay up front, whereas by taxi you pay when you reach the destination.
Right, yes.
By the time you reach the destination by taxi, the inflation's gone up 50%. So the IMF is a advisory institution and a lending authority under the aegis of the United Nations. We travelled on the UN passports, which in itself was very nice because it gave us benefits.
So reflecting on Israel, where it came from, obviously in 1948, through those troubled times of the 70s, where reading between the lines, they could have gone broke in inverted commas, to where they are today, almost an economic powerhouse. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, that's a very interesting question, because Israel does not have great resources, really. It doesn't. I'll never forget a statement by Sharon, who at the time was agricultural minister, who was explaining the resource constraints in Israel, and he was saying that Israel has an economic advantage in oranges and soldiers. It was an unforgettable comment. They have and when you reflect, Israel doesn't have oil resources like the Arabian states. It does not. And that's one of the future things that will happen when the Lord returns. It will flourish like the desert will flourish. It's a country with very limited resources, but it's had an extraordinary growth because the people are so technically skilled. They developed all these technical industries, these high-tech industries, where they have the wonderful expertise, and and the growth of the country, the economic growth of the country has been quite remarkable, given the general paucity. You think of Israel relative to the Arabian states, which are awash with oil and all that. Israel doesn't really have very much, and not in this dispensation. So it's quite it's miraculous, I think you could say, that they've done so well, and the growth rate is very high. And how they ever manage to finance their defence spending is beyond me. Of course, they get a lot of external help on that, but the defence spending for a small country of only about 9 million people is extremely onerous. So it is somewhat of an economic miracle, I would say, and a very fascinating case of God direction.
Well, you didn't know it at the time, but when you moved to Washington, you were going to be there for, I think it was nearly 50 years, was it?
Yeah. So after the 3 years, I mentioned I was there initially by secondment from the Reserve Bank. After the end of 3 years, I just had to either decide to go back to the Reserve Bank, return to Sydney, or to stay on in Washington. And that was a major decision. I eventually signed my resignation letter from the Reserve Bank, and with a sort of a trembling hand, really, because they'd been absolutely wonderful for me, to me, and I made quite sure they were happy that I was doing this. I didn't want to do anything which would upset them, and so I resigned from the Reserve Bank and joined the permanent staff of the IMF, and was with them for 30 years. So a long time, really, from 1971 to 2001.
And then that gave you extraordinary opportunities to get involved in Africa and the subcontinent as well. Tell us about some of those experiences.
Well, as I mentioned earlier, I was initially initially I was in the research department, but then I went as I said, to the European department, and I worked on Israel. But then I went to many missions all over Europe, Portugal, Greece, Spain, Malta, Finland, Yugoslavia, Romania, some of them several times. And oddly enough, South Africa was still in the European department because nobody else would have South Africa. So I went on missions to South Africa as well. I suppose, I'm not sure, almost 20 years, I guess, in the European department, which is very interesting because visiting all these countries, and the trips would be about 2 or 3 weeks at a time, these negotiating trips were 2 or 3 weeks at a time. So they weren't long, protracted absences from Washington, from home. They were sort of, they were not terribly intrusive, even from an ecclesial point of view. But of course, I made good use of visiting ecclesias in Germany and Finland, and most of these places in South Africa, most of the places I visited ecclesias. And some of my mission leaders, or the heads of the sections, they knew that I had a scriptural interest, and on Sundays they would never. I found this quite touching, actually. They'd always free me on Sunday mornings to go to a local ecclesial service, particularly when I was going to Africa, when there's so much ecclesial activity there. They'd often give me the freedom to visit ecclesias and have time off from work for a few hours. So then after all those years in the European department, I was transferred to the African department, and that was absolutely wonderful, unforgettable, because in that particular case, I was asked, what country would you like to work on? And I said, I'd love to work on Malawi. And Malawi at that time, of course, was growing leaps and bounds ecclesially. And so I went to Malawi many, many times, and Mozambique and Zimbabwe.
And you've seen the gospel message grow amazingly in those years. Well,
the most amazing was Malawi. Malawi, as you probably know from the magazines, Malawi now has a Christadelphian membership of about 10,000, I think. And in the ALS diary for Mozambique, the current membership of Mozambique ecclesia is about 11,000. And when you go to Malawi, driving around Malawi is just like driving around Birmingham, really. You drive around, there's the ecclesia here and the ecclesia there, and another village, there's another ecclesia there. And of course, I went to a lot of these ecclesias, and I found that totally charming. Just most of them, you walk through the cornfields, or they're out in the rural areas, and you go to a little unpretentious mud hut, and sit in a African ecclesial service. I found it exceptionally uplifting, just wonderful, really. And so I've always had a special affection for Malawi, which is I must say, a very biblical country in a way, and noticeably so even in business life. I remember quite well some of the speeches, after dinner speeches, business speeches that the Malawian central bank governor or something or other would cite something make a point and cite them or reinforce the point by some scripture quotation. And I remember very well one occasion where the mission leader for Malawi asked me, he had to prepare some after dinner response. He wanted to make a point. He said, "Ron, can you find me a scripture quotation which will support the point I'm making, whatever it was?" So I did that, and when buses roll down the street in Malawi, they have signs on the side, God is good, and you get off the bus and they're playing God be with you till we meet again. It's a remarkably religious country or Christian country in that sense, and because of the fascinating influence of David Livingstone. I'm sure you read the history of David Livingstone, the great explorer. His influence on that area comes right down to modern times. But it's very fascinating to me to see the Malawian and the Mozambican ecclesia particularly doing so extraordinarily well.
And the other area which we need to talk about is the subcontinent, India and Bangladesh in particular.
Well, that's right. That's coming towards now the end of my career with the IMF. When you've been in the IMF for quite a long time, you become eligible for what they call resident representative assignments. In other words, you represent the IMF in that country, and they're not all that easy to get assigned to, but they're attractive in many ways. So I didn't want to finish the IMF career without that sort of experience. I really wanted to go to Sri Lanka, actually. I wanted to take the IMF position there. It's a small office located in the country for 2 or 3 years, not traveling to and fro Washington. You're actually located in the country for 2 or 3 years. And I wanted to go to Sri Lanka, but it wasn't available. The only option I could take was in Bangladesh. That didn't enthuse me too much. Being a Muslim country, I thought the prospects of being fruitful in a missionary sense wouldn't be all that promising. I knew that work-wise, it would be very interesting, but then I suddenly realized that maybe the Lord's telling you go somewhere which you haven't thought of before. So I accepted the position in Bangladesh and had three wonderful years there. Really, just work-wise, it was extremely interesting working there on the economic issues of Bangladesh, but then having an opportunity to spiritually witness in a country which is basically Muslim was a challenge, but it's another spiritual growth experience.
And we have a number of brothers and sisters in Bangladesh now.
Yes, we do. Yes, we do. We have three main ecclesias in Bangladesh now. It's a difficult country. It's heavily overpopulated, and it's not easy to witness there because you can't give out literature, of course, in a Muslim country. Lots of things you can't do. But the long and short of it, I didn't know how to go about this because work-wise I was very busy. But how to witness the first few weeks I was a bit puzzled. Well, how am I going to do anything useful here when you can't give out leaflets? You can't do this. You can't do that. And I looked through I got an idea. I got a directed idea, I think, to look through the telephone book, and I saw two references on the Bible. One was Bible Society of Bangladesh, another one was Bible Student Fellowship of Bangladesh. So I rang the number of Bible Student Fellowship of Bangladesh and said, I'd like to have a chat to you about what you're doing here. So I went out to see them, and I think they found it rather unusual for a foreigner a diplomat to sort of be showing interest in their activities. And they asked me, what my background. I gave them all the Christadelphian background. I didn't hide anything. I said we were not mainstream Orthodox Christianity at all, but we were very keen Bible students. And then after a week or two, they said, would you like to lead one of our studies here?
Oh, wow.
And they asked me, what have you been studying lately? Well, I said, I've been studying the Acts of the Apostles. And the Acts of the Apostles, I think, is a wonderful book where you don't seem as though you're imposing a doctrinal view. You just go through the book and what did Peter say about this and what did Paul say about something else.
Let the apostles tell the story.
Let them speak. And that was very remarkable because the response I had from the students, they said, can we meet outside the classes, have additional classes. So anyway, I continued to do these classes at the Bible Student Fellowship, but one by one, quite a number of them came to my home, the IMF home there, which and from that, the early ones were baptized. That led to the baptism of quite a few. And then that led to others, family connections and things like that. So the preaching was there. None of it was by advertisement, or it was all basically by word of mouth. And that was very exciting because it was just yet one more answer of prayer. And so I still have the greatest affection for the folks in Bangladesh. They need our prayers. It's not an easy country at all. It's very congested and difficult, and economic problems are plenty. But we got some very faithful members there now.
An extraordinary opportunity that you had, but the time had to come to an end because you had a forced retirement. You were a compulsory retirement, as it was.
Yeah, well, that's right. When the IMF, when you're 67, 65, you have to retire. So that's it. And I didn't mind. It would have been that's another stage of life, that was it. I'd had a particularly fulfilling employment, which led in all sorts of directions spiritually, I thought, which I'd never envisaged. None of it was planned. It all happened. And that's why I feel the whole issue of God direction is so important. None of that was planned. It was just happened, one after another. And it just led to one spiritual opportunity after another. So anyway, retirement came, yes, and I stayed on in the US for a while.
What brought you back to Australia?
Yes, I stayed on in the US because I enjoyed ecclesial life there very much, and I knew many brothers and sisters, and I also did quite a bit of traveling because in North America you have more chances to go to Britain and that more easily than in Australia. But when the years climb, you've got to think of the wisdom of things, and so I thought it was high time to come back to my hometown. So that led eventually to a return to Adelaide, my hometown.
And then we have the full circle.
Yeah, we come back to where you belong.
As you look back on your life, what's a takeaway message? What's one of the most important reflections you can share with us?
I do think it's an issue really of how the Lord directs you. At the time, you don't often see it that way, but in retrospect, you can see it. You're meant to do this, or you're meant to go to India, or you're meant to go to the US, and it turns out to open up vistas of things you haven't even thought about before, really. My feeling is, I don't know whether you agree with me on this, I feel that the Lord directs our lives much more than we sometimes acknowledge. And that's something that you see in retrospect. You see it more when you're older. You can look back, you can see, well, that was remarkable that you're working on Israel. It was remarkable. But it just all happened. So I just have a strong feeling that the life is like a flowing stream. But I think the Lord is in that flowing stream that guides and shapes you and leads you and opens up opportunities for you, which turn out to be evidence of providential guidance. sometimes we don't talk about that too much, and we're sometimes a bit disinclined even to talk about testimonies and this sort of thing. And that language is probably not the best, but I think more discussion about how the Lord leads us and will lead us is very important for faithful service. I don't know whether you agree on that.
I think what seems evident to me is you had a great foundation in terms of your outlook on life, your biblical outlook, and you allowed God to work in your life.
Well, you just give the Lord thanks, and you realise when you get older that life is quite short. Really, life goes by pretty quickly, and what a waste of time. We can be real procrastinators, waiting for this and waiting for that. Sometimes the Lord is guiding us, and we need to respond very quickly. Because especially when you get into retirement years, you realise that the life is just like it is a vapor. It's just come and gone, and so that means that one has to make good use of the 80 years or whatever it might happen to be. It's quite a limited pilgrimage, which means that every moment has to be thought through carefully as much as we can, and not just wasted.
Ron, thanks very much for joining Wilderness Conversations.
It's a pleasure. It's a pleasure to be with you.